The budget the governor wants and the Medicaid dollars he needs to get it. With the courts looking on, what's the outlook? Pressure building within and outside the General Assembly for a highway program. Is there one in reach? Both chambers meeting under the criminal cloud created by a half dozen former members. Is a new code of conduct the answer? All that, plus teacher salaries, tax cuts, retirement programs. Coming up on Arkansas Week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Arkansas Week. Week one of the 92nd General Assembly, and a fairly abbreviated week for the lawmakers. The highlight of the past several days being the formal beginning of the second and final term as governor of the Honorable Asa Hutchinson. His program and perhaps some legislative alternatives, our subject in the next half hour. Gwen Moritz, editor of Arkansas Business, joins us. Andrew DeMillo is Capitol Bureau Chief of the Associated Press, and Steve Bronner is an independent journalist based in Little Rock. Andrew, let's start with you. We had an inaugural address, actually two of them, one in the House chamber, the other on the Capitol steps. We pretty much had an outline of what Mr. Hutchinson was going to propose well in advance.
Yeah, exactly. As you said, Governor Hutchinson gave two addresses, a State of the State address and then an inaugural address, kind of the prose and the poetry there. And really, we knew what the priorities were for this session and really kind of went over the highlights of what he's terming a growth agenda. His tax cut plan, his proposal to reorganize state government, and his proposal to raise teacher minimum salaries, setting aside $60 million for that, as well as yet unseen, plan to increase funding for highways. And that's probably the one we got the least amount of details on. But really, there weren't any surprises, weren't really anything significantly new that we heard in either one of these addresses.
Well, still hanging, of course, what he's got to get done. Two things have to be resolved, of course, and the first is the tax cut package. And that would sort of appear to depend on whether or not we can get, or he can get, the Arkansas Works, the Medicaid expansion, reauthorized.
Well, and actually, on Arkansas,
they're interconnected. I mean,
yeah, they're interconnected. Everything with the budget seems to be interconnected with Arkansas Works. This may be actually the first session where we might not see that much drama over Arkansas Works. Heading into the session, legislative leaders and the governor have said they don't expect the same type of funding fight over Arkansas Works, the Medicaid expansion. Partly because some of the biggest opponents of it lost in primaries last year. The one big question that's still kind of hanging over it is the work requirement and the lawsuit over it. There seems to not be that much nervousness about if a ruling came out striking down that work requirement, whether or not that would undermine some of the support for the program that you see among Republicans. And timing-wise, we may not see that ruling until well after the session anyways.
Well, it would appear that that very interconnectedness that we mentioned might make almost irrelevant the judge's ruling, the court's ruling on the work requirement. Everything hinges on keeping those federal dollars coming in.
Even without the work requirement, even if that goes away.
Yeah, and also, before the session, Senate President Jim Hendren actually kind of made the comparison between what's happening in Washington and the fights over Arkansas Works in the past year. Basically saying that we're seeing in Washington what happens when you shut down government over a policy fight. And I think he was kind of making the case that there doesn't seem to be the same appetite for that, especially seeing that play out on the national stage on a different issue.
Almost a half century ago, we hate to say, when the Governor Dale Bumpers proposed a reorganization to the General Assembly, there was sturm and drang. You got it through easily enough, certainly in retrospect. There doesn't seem to be that level of concern among the lawmakers this time around. Steve?
Well, so far, basically, I've tried to think of a single major issue that the governor has wanted that he hasn't gotten. He at least he's made concessions, but in the end, if he's wanted, he's got it. It's still early in this Republican time, this Republican era. The legislature is still willing to follow the governor's lead, and plus it's a classic conservative issue. I mean, if you're a conservative and you're against making government more efficient, that would be a pretty tough argument to make, and probably there doesn't seem to be a lot of opposition on the Democrat side either. So that seems ready to go, but it's going to require a number of bills that are being introduced right now that will be discussed and then consolidated into a single 1,500-page bill. Now, anything that's got 1,500 pages in it will result in some pretty good discussion. There will be interests that will not want these changes for whatever reason. So there will be a lot of discussion, but in the end, we will probably reorganize government.
You touch a state agency, no matter how obscure, or board or commission, no matter how obscure it is, it likely has at least one legislative patron and some sort of constituency.
Why do we keep doing this, though? I mean, we've had a state government for a long time. Can't we get the organization right? Can't we get the chart right, the structure?
Well, it keeps shifting. New agencies or boards, commissions keep being created.
Yeah, and we've seen kind of the examples of what happened. Since bumpers, various governors have kind of delved into the reorganization debate. The governor refers to it as transformation. We even saw it with Huckabee merging Health and Human Services. Right. His predecessor, Governor Beebe, one of the first things he did was split them back up.
Undo it.
Yeah, and that's not part of the equation this time around. I think this next week we're going to kind of get an idea of what opposition, if any, will be there. We're going to start seeing legislative committees get into this. But yeah, when you start getting into each of these agencies, each of these boards and commissions, there's a legislator who's going to have some pet issue with it, and also you're going to have lobbyists connected to this as well too. So the big question is how much. We're talking about going from 42 to 15. How much does that change once people start looking at the details of this and going through these thousands of pages?
Mr. Hutchinson has proposed this as or pitched it to some extent as a cost-saving mechanism, that it will result in perhaps fewer state employees and eventually maybe even fewer agencies. There is some skepticism in the General Assembly about that, as we've kind of noted. It means Mr. Hutchinson may have to read fewer memos and have fewer meetings, as it's more an efficiency gesture on his part, or tool on his part, as a management adjustment.
Well, he said that he can't possibly have if he has a 1-hour meeting with 42 agency heads, he can't meet with them very often. So he wants a cabinet that he can work with, and 15 is a better number for him than 42.
All right, tax legislation. It seems a foregone conclusion, has for quite a while, that the trend toward tax cutting in Arkansas government, state government anyway, would continue. And it seems a lead pipe cinch that income taxes are going to go down. The big concern has been in the details. In the administration's first proposal, would some people eventually wind up paying more taxes? Doesn't look like they will. Well, by the time the tinkering is.
Yeah, and that was why actually one of the parts of the governor's State of the State address, that one of the applause lines there was when he was talking about his tax cut plan. He made a reference to making sure that no one has a net increase in taxes. And part of that was a reference to finance officials saying that even with standard deduction, there would still be some taxpayers who would see a net increase, and that's something that he and legislative leaders are trying to find a fix on, and basically trying to find some kind of hold harmless provision in that. And so that's going to be the big question on it: is how do they do that fix, and will that be enough to get over the 3/4 requirement that they're going to have to do on this legislation anyways, and is it going to be enough to keep the Republicans in line and maybe even win over some Democrats who have expressed concerns about these cuts, about the impact it has on the budget, and the concern that it's not geared enough toward middle income, lower income Arkansans? Well,
there, as Andrew just said, there was some Democratic pushback on it. It was fairly gentle. All things considered, they know their margins in the both
Right.
chambers. but the concern was that we are leaving unaddressed some crucial needs.
But I think the governor has his eye on the competitive question. If you just look at our income tax rate here, it looks like people pay more taxes here. That may not be necessarily true, but I mean in total taxes. But if you look at that income tax rate, and I think, I understand that he wants to get it down so that it almost for optics, but then there's real dollars attached to it.
Well, speaking to the Arkansas School Board Association a few weeks ago, the governor said that he had had a conversation with the governor of Massachusetts, and he emphasized Massachusetts, and the governor had asked, how much is y'all's tax rate? And he said, when I told the governor of Massachusetts what our tax rate is, he gasped, and that is a very big incentive for Governor Hutchinson to try to get that down, but just because of the way it looks that you're trying to attract business, attract industry, and that appearance, even though Gwen's right, who knows if we're actually paying higher taxes here, that appearance is enough he's got to sell the state.
Well, if you compared, say, property taxes, it would be completely,
Bingo.
Completely different.
Yeah. One thing, one revenue stream that's going to have to go up, no matter what that stream is, if we want a highway program, Steve, is what? Fuel taxes.
Well, that's the
sales taxes. There's always a move to pull sales taxes away from the general fund or a portion of it.
Right. That issue is the one that's kind of hanging over the session right now. As Andrew mentioned, that there weren't a lot of details about that, and there's a good reason for that because there's not an answer right now. And it's going to come after taxes. After taxes, then we're going to talk about highways. The factions, there are different ways of looking at this. Speaker Shepard has mentioned wanting to pull money out from some other areas first. Try that first. Okay, so where do you get that money? You can't take it from schools because then you have a lawsuit. You can't take it from colleges and universities because funding has been flat for many, many years there. Human services, the governor has tried to make that more efficient, but a lot of that's going to go to the tax cut. Corrections, where do you get that money? So that's not an easy way to go, but maybe we can find some money underneath the seat cushions. The other option, there are some legislators who want to just get more money themselves. We were elected, let's do this. But that would require a 75% vote, and that's not going to happen. What the governor wants to do is then just send an initiative and ask our ballot proposal and let us vote for it. And that's probably what's going to happen. So where would you get that money? Well, the easiest way to do this, and the governor has mentioned this, is just prolonging the half-cent sales tax that the voters voted for in 2012 for the Connecting Arkansas program. It's going to go out in about 4 or 5 years, and extending that forever would raise a lot of money. Not enough, but it would raise some. Another option would be raising diesel taxes. Even the truckers are for a diesel tax increase, 5 cents or 10 cents if we can make it focused on freight, on their freight lanes. So that's 2 ways of doing that. So those are probably the 2 easiest ways to raise money, along with whatever you can find in state government. But everything that you take out of state government has a defender. And there will be people who will fight that tooth and nail, as there have been in the past.
But is it almost a lead pipe since this is going before the electorate, whatever program is proposed?
Well, there are still plenty of Republican legislators who pledged that they would resist all efforts to raise taxes, and sending a ballot initiative to the voters is not resisting that effort. They could argue, and they would argue, that that's different, and that's true, but still, there's always that fear of being primaried. So one thing that will happen, or likely will happen, is if we are given a chance to vote on this, legislators are going to want to have a little more say in where the money goes. Right now, the Highway Commission is constitutionally independent. There's very little, the legislature appropriates the money, but the Highway Commission decides where it goes. There will be at least more, there will be a desire to have more say over that among legislators who vote for this initiative if it happens.
Yeah, Andrew?
Yeah, I think this is going to be the issue that we're really not going to see much movement on it until the middle, maybe even the late part of the session, partly because the governor has not presented a plan on it. He's really leaving it to legislative leaders to try to craft some kind of consensus. how you craft a consensus on something where there's significant opposition to either one of the approaches. I'm not sure how you do that. And one of the big questions is going to be, if the consensus, if that doesn't come together, is there going to be a point where the governor is going to come forward with his own plan on it? And how do you get past the opposition to tapping into general revenue, or how do you get past the anti-tax sentiment, even to referring taxes to voters? And I'm not really sure how you get past that, especially with the makeup of this legislature.
Here's another issue that that surfaced fairly. What, you want a word on that?
I just think that we will trace the end of rational America to this pledge never to raise taxes for anything, no matter how worthy the purpose.
Mr. Norquist. All right.
Yes.
Okay. One other thing that came up fairly early in the session, and that was some proposed changes to the formula by which state employees contribute to and are rewarded by the public employees' pension system. You deal with that, and you're talking real dollars, not individuals. So,
And
where's
real
this going to
anger.
go? Yeah.
I don't know. I couldn't tell you, but I know that that's one of the few areas where working for the state government is more attractive than the private sector, because they have had these pensions and they're guaranteed. And when you watch what the stock market's doing, people
Health benefits too.
and health benefits, that's going to really change the calculus for people deciding to work for or to stay with state government.
And that's what makes it so hard to cut current state government employees, is because the retirees are funded off the backs of the current employees. So if you cut the employees too much, there's no way to pay for the retirees.
At the conclusion, just minutes after the conclusion of last week's edition of this program, another indictment was unsealed against another former state legislator. Both chambers of the General Assembly have been touched by this latest wave of scandals. Actually, there are two kind of separate investigations going on, or three?
Actually.
All right, yeah. Underway. The new President Pro Tem of the Senate, I think, and with a nod also from the new Speaker, have emphasized that business as usual out here is no longer acceptable. Andrew.
Yeah, and that was actually kind of a surprising thing from this past week was, as you said, Senator Hendren, the Senate President, really made his opening speech, the centerpiece of it, ethics, and really talking about kind of ending the era of corruption, trying to restore trust in the legislature. And there's going to be some kind of legislative package on this. Apparently there's a bipartisan group of lawmakers who are working on package of 5 to 6 bills. We don't have much details on what that would include, but we do know what's been talked about before. Increasing fines for ethics violations. Also, there's been legislation already filed dealing with retirement benefits for elected officials or public employees convicted of felonies, felony corruption, basically. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that part of it. It's kind of interesting to see on the debate on this. Discussion about how much of these changes would have really prevented what we've seen in these ongoing corruption probes, and that's kind of been a theme. Is a lot of the legislative leaders saying that a lot of these things are the law already should prevent anyways, and so but they're really concerned. They understand that there is this view of the Capitol and this reputation right now of the legislature, from the past couple of years, these very shocking revelations that we've seen in these corruption probes.
A former Arkansas legislator remarked on this network earlier this week that no matter what sort of ethics code one writes, there are already long-standing existing laws against murder, and in Little Rock so far this year there have been 5 of them.
But I think the idea of some legislation that even that hits them in the wallet for doing it. I mean, it's one thing to risk going to prison. It's another thing to say, I served all those years and I'm not going to get that pension that I was counting on because I was frittering away all my other money. Have you noticed how many of our legislators also have tax liens or, other collection suits against them because I think some of them need somebody else to give them a guaranteed pension. So the idea that there is a long tail to this thing that will cost them more, because some of these have been kind of penny ante. You know, the amount of money that they have corrupted themselves over. These are, as they said in Casablanca, a cut rate parasite. So some of them have been small amounts. If the cost in the long term is more than the short term benefit, that might help. That might help.
Yeah, Steve Brawner.
Well, a lot of what Senator Hedger was talking about also was, I think, the culture. In fact, he mentioned the words "a culture of corruption" out there, and talked about how that will have to be a big part of it, because there's billions of dollars floating around the Capitol for the next 3 or 4 months, and there's millions of dollars in campaign donations that are on the line. So legislators are swimming in money, and there are so many temptations out there that basically it depends on what's acceptable. And it's clear that for a time there was too much. There was an attitude among some legislators that they could kind of reach out and grab some of that money a little bit. And so there has to be an idea that this is just not acceptable. You know, we will drive 77 in a 70. And one of the reasons that we will do that is because no one shakes their finger at us when we do. It's generally acceptable to do that. Well, that culture has to change in the Capitol. That any walking up to that line will be met with a lot of social rejection. And they have started. There's a new ethics committee that's going to be chaired by Senator Missy Irvin from Mountain View, that would basically allow senators to tattle on each other and make a complaint if there's some kind of ethics. Now, will that ethics violation, will anybody actually do that? I don't know. The one senator who was most likely to do that, Senator Brian King, who didn't care if anybody liked him, is no longer in the legislature. So will the Senate, which is such a chummy place, actually do that? I don't know, but at least there's an effort to change the culture, and that's what matters.
Well, there is also this. There would appear to be, there is concern that there is more fuel to be added to the fire.
I'm not predicting more, but I won't be surprised if there's more. There are other names that are being looked. I mean, we know there are other investigations going on, and so we'll see how those shake out. One thing about this culture issue, though, is that Gilbert Baker seems to think. I mean, he did not.
Former senator from Conway.
Former senator. He was not indicted for anything he did while he was in the legislature, nor for anything he did to influence the legislature. He went for the judicial branch there, and so the culture may not be limited to. Of course, this is one example. Is just one example, but he seemed to think the culture wasn't limited to the Capitol.
We also have in a Missouri jail cell a central figure still sitting. He has yet to be sentenced. Mr. Cranford, who did a great deal of business involving the Department of Human Services and grants there. Presumably, he is chatting. He's thought to be chatting anyway with representatives of the U.S. Department of Justice, whose agents have, I think, for the last 2.5, 3 years, I'm told, vacuumed the state capitol of documents and recordings of committee meetings. They've got everything.
Well, of 5 legislators who have been convicted, only 2 of them are in prison. So what are and it's been a while, so what are the other 3 doing right now? I mean, you can make the assumption that at least some of them, 1 of them, 2 of them, are talking. And what are they saying? Who knows? But if you are a legislator who did anything that walked up to that line, you were probably a little bit nervous right now, or you should be, because this investigation has been going on a long time, and it continues.
All right, we're going to leave it there simply because we're out of time. Thanks to everybody for coming into the panel. Thanks, as always, to you for watching. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.